TG Makati, Batipico, TG Makane, Bocognon, Bahalu Hurita, oh, we love Bahalu Hurita, Sakanyo, Hoko, the player, Doto, Mamanu, the order, oh, we love Hoko, the player, let's all, Mamanu, the order, Sakanyo, Baga,
If this is your first time listening to our podcast, welcome. Our programming brings a diversity of voices connected to Myanmar to share their perspectives, thoughts, and reflections about what has been happening there since the military coup in 2021. All of our guests share one thing in common, a deep personal stake in the ongoing crisis. And it is an honor for us to be able to bring their voices into your earbuds. But however difficult it may be to hear some of their stories, we hope that you will come away with a deeper and more nuanced understanding of what is happening there. I'm really excited to have the conversation that we'll be following with Jesse Phenow in Minneapolis. He has quite a story to tell about his own life and how that's intersected with Karen culture. And I'm really looking forward to seeing where this goes. So Jesse, thanks so much for finally taking the chance to join us and sit down and chat a bit about your life and work.
And I'm humbled and honored, my friend. I'm not sure I'm worthy of a full podcast episode, but I'm excited to chat. That's for sure.
Yeah, I am too. You know, I saw, we'll get into your whole story later, but just to give a little bit of background, I saw your account, your Instagram account, and representing the organization you have in Minneapolis, St. Paul, Urban Village. I was so fortunate to get a chance to visit there last month and to meet you and see the work you're doing. It's so unique and so needed at the time. We'll get into how you built all of that, and let's actually get into that now. Let's start where it all began. If you can share a bit about yourself, your life story, where you came from, and give the audience a picture of who you are before you came in contact with members of the Karen community there in Minnesota.
Yeah, definitely, man alive. Well, I feel like the appropriate place to start would be I'm the son of Rich and Jody Phenow, and it has just been the absolute honor and privilege of my life to be called theirs. They are two phenomenal parents. I grew up in a suburb of Minneapolis called Richfield, and Richfield's it's a pretty cool place. It's a very diverse city, both ethnically and economically, and so that's kind of where my upbringing takes place, and just a lot of really rich experiences there, and had a very amazing and diverse group of friends. And then eventually, after high school, I would go on to a university, actually still in the Twin Cities, called Bethel. And Bethel University was a good place for me in that I was kind of pursuing football, and that was a good fit. But also, it's a pretty conservative place, and it's also very white and very affluent. And so for me, it was just at times hard to kind of reconcile some of those conservative values with, I think the experiences and relationships that I was accustomed to having. And so I really struggled actually at Bethel, and just felt like, it wasn't the safest space for me and some of my values and beliefs. And so I'll save the long story, but basically I ended up starting to volunteer with a refugee resettlement organization while I was a junior at Bethel. And full disclosure, I think I signed up to be a volunteer, thinking, you know, gosh, I'm going to be able to help some recently arrived refugees, and I'll be the friend and ally and welcomer that they've been needing. And so I went to my very first session of volunteering, where I was tasked with kind of coming alongside a newly arrived family from Myanmar. And I walked up to the front door of the house and knocked. And as the door opened and I was embraced, I found out almost immediately that I had the completely wrong narrative, and that
Mhm.
this family, they didn't need me. And, in fact, in a lot of ways, I was the welcomed, not the welcomer. And so I think just that family's posture and sense of welcome was something that I desperately needed and hadn't really experienced before. So fast forward, I mean, at this point in time, I don't even think I can point out Myanmar on a map for you.
Mm,
And
mhm,
I come to learn that this family is an ethnic minority from Myanmar, and they identify themselves as Karen, or as they would say in their language, Ganya. And so it was just, a really kind of beautiful friendship. Started as a friendship. I would go visit them once a week on Sundays. We would, eat Ganya food together. And at this time, no one's speaking English in the family. So we're kind of just doing hand motions and smiling and laughing a lot at our attempts to communicate. But they have 7 boys in their family,
mm,
and so I feel like the kind of the first language that we really spoke was that of wrestling matches. And so we really, yeah, I think just kind of hit a stride in our friendship over that first year together. And then, I think as time went on, I just my proximity and connection to this family really sparked just curiosity in me, and I wanted to know more about, what hey, what's going on in Myanmar? Why are there, these refugee camps in Thailand? And so I ended up doing my senior thesis paper in college on just kind of the conflict and history of the Karen Revolution in Myanmar. And so that was just, I think, kind of brought, our relationship a layer deeper. And, I, towards the end of my senior year, wasn't really sure what I wanted to do with my life and
mhm,
what career I wanted to get into. So I actually just decided that, hey, I'm pretty interested to learn a little bit more about these people that I really care deeply for. Um, I think I want to go to Thailand and maybe then eventually into Myanmar. So I bought a one-way ticket just a couple months after I graduated, and ended up in a um, city in Thailand known as Mae Sot. And for anyone who is familiar with, kind of the history of the Karen Revolution, this is just a really um, important city with a lot of history. And so I spent a good chunk of time in Mae Sot. I traveled up and down the border, got to, kind of sneak into the refugee camps and hang out with some friends that I had made. And then eventually that led me into sneaking into Myanmar for the first time. and going to stay in some Karen villages that where my friends had family, and that was just a really life-changing experience, I think, because for the first time, the relationship that I had with this Gignaw family back in Minnesota, um, there was finally some cultural context to things that maybe previously had perplexed me, just about how they lived and how they acted and elements of their culture. Uh, Being immersed in their homeland, I think, just really gave me this kind of aha perspective. And not that I understood everything, but um, for example, I think I remember the very first time I went to go visit this Gignaw family, and I saw this. Of course, in Minnesota, it's snowy and cold, and I saw this big red splotch in the snow, and I thought,
Mm.
"Oh no, man! Maybe someone's like bleeding in the house because there's just all these drips of red in the snow, and it was right by the door." So it really confused me for a long time, and then I went, to Thailand and Myanmar for the first time, and I realized, oh, that was betel nut. You know, everyone
Right.
spits betel nut, and when you spit it in the snow, it kind of looks like blood, and just things like that. That oh man, these connections started to make more and more sense. So anyway, fast forward again, I'll kinda try to cruise my way through this, but I came back from that initial trip and just, felt like, our relationship got that much more, intimate, between this family and I, and then kinda through this family into the broader Gignac community in Minnesota, and, at this time, I started working a job that where I was doing mental health services with a lot of Gignac and Karenni families in Minnesota. Um, and yeah, long story short, I was working this job. I was living in my parents' basement. This Gignac family that I was close with was in a really bad, kind of slumlord situation, and finally, I just kinda asked, "Hey, would you be interested in, buying a house together? I don't think I can afford a house on my own, and, it seems like this might be a good situation for you to get out of. Would you be interested in going in on a house together?" And so, they said, "Yeah," and we looked for a house, and we bought an up and down duplex, in East St. Paul, which is kind of the heart of the, Gignac community. And we've been living there since 2018, and it's just been a ton of fun. We kind of have this open door policy where the boys spend a bunch of time downstairs with me, and I'll come up for dinner and lunch sometimes, and just a really beautiful journey from friendship to what I would describe now as kinship. And
Hmm.
yeah, that kinship has transformed my life. Um, and yeah, I think kind of the last thing to cap off this story is that maybe a year into living together in this house, there's this old abandoned bar kind of at the end of our street that we just saw this for sale sign on, and we kept driving by it, and eventually we just inquired about it and got some really amazing, generous help from some friends
Mhm.
and bought it, and then started this nonprofit that we've since called the Urban Village. And the Urban Village exists to accompany Karen and Karenni youth as they embark on a journey of connecting, healing, and launching. And yeah, we have been around since 2019. We have kind of this community space, as you know, that we've filled with Karen and Karenni art and different cultural items and artifacts and books and things like that. And we just try to share space really well, and then we have a handful of programs that we run on top of that. So, gosh, it's been a ride, and it's just been a ton of fun and transformative. I'm super super grateful uh, to kind of have been on that journey and ended up where I am. It's amazing.
That's great. That is and that has to be a record for just having 10 minutes to summarize such a full life story in such an easy to follow way. That's just like a complete picture of all the parts we can now break down, and really beautiful to hear that progression from one end to the other, and just to go back through that life story that you talked about and ask some questions at the different marks and points to flesh out some of the things that you said. Just starting first, I mean, your first interaction with Kenya people was when you were a junior at this conservative college and wanting to be an ally
Mm.
for them. And you didn't use this word, and I don't know if this word is quite appropriate to what you were thinking, but it struck me that you had a sense before meeting them of perhaps being something of a white
Mm.
savior, of wanting to swoop in and help them, and perhaps feel something about yourself as you were serving these poor immigrant people. And instead, you commented that the first interaction upon meeting them was that, oh, actually, I'm the one who
Mm.
needs them. And I wanted to ask about why you felt that way. What, when you say you needed them, when you met them and you felt that you had this attraction towards them, or they had something that you needed, or they had something that helped you to grow and to fill something or be something more. What was it exactly that you needed? What did you see in them meeting them that first time, and then over the weeks and years that followed? What was it that you were gaining from them and growing in ways that you didn't even realize at the time?
Man, Joe, you ask great questions, my friend.
Thank you.
Gosh, yeah, I think as I reflect on that moment, I just really didn't know what I didn't know, and I think you can attest to this as well.
Mm,
When you get proximate to someone who's experienced a refugee reality, and you start to
mhm,
listen to their story, you start to learn about their savvy, gritty resilience. Um, then you recognize, boy, I've never ever had to attempt to navigate that type of reality. And man, there's a lot that I can learn, and there's just a lot that I appreciate about who you are in spite of that reality that you've experienced. I think one of the things that struck me, and I know that this is true across many of the ethnic peoples of Myanmar, but man, the sense of hospitality and welcome is just completely and radically different from anything that
mhm,
I've experienced here in the United States.
mm,
And I know that you can attest to that as well, but
mm,
it's
mm,
just like, hey, how can I, like, what do you need? Are you hungry? Like, are you thirsty? How can I,
mm,
serve you? And I think, yeah, that I've certainly learned a lot about hospitality from experiencing it from the Kenya and Karenni communities of Minnesota. And so, and that's something that, again, I don't think I realized how deficient I was until I experienced that level of
mm.
hospitality and welcome from these amazing people. So, yeah, that's just one among many for sure.
Right. So the hospitality was definitely something that started to have its mark on you as you became familiar and accustomed with them. I think anytime we start to move away from our culture and into another culture and other people, it teaches us not just how we might lack in something, but how our culture, our upbringing, our conditions have not taught us something about humanity. And it allows us, as we interact with that new culture, it allows us to grow in ways that perhaps our own culture and family and community didn't necessarily teach us. And that that's a great thing about traveling, or in your case, not necessarily traveling, but just coming into contact with the other in the form of the large Kenya population of Minneapolis, St. Paul. So as you started to grow and to move into the community, become more familiar, become perhaps a part of the community, in what ways did that change you in positive ways? In what ways did that impact your behavior, make you become a different person with different traits, make you aware of different things? How did it help you? How did the sustained contact interaction with the Kenya community in the Minnesota area and then in Myanmar and Thailand, in what ways did that start to change who you were as a person and how you saw the world and fellow humanity?
Gosh, man alive. That's a great question. I think, I think maybe the first thing that comes to mind and maybe the biggest is, you mentioned this kind of like white savior
Mm,
complex that I definitely think, looking back on it, I
mm,
had, partially just because it is embedded in the culture of white
mhm,
supremacy in
mhm,
America. And then certainly in the, conservative evangelical
mm,
world.
mm, mm,
The whole idea of it is that I have something to offer that you don't have
mm,
yet, And so I think there is a real savior mentality. And so for me, I think the biggest thing that it really transformed in me is my posture.
mhm,
Um, I've since come to realize that, man, when you posture yourself as having something to offer, you really miss out on an opportunity to learn
mhm,
and to receive. And I think now I really try to posture myself in every new context that I'm in with a new person or a new relationship as a listener and a learner. And I think that has really important and transformative um, capabilities when we posture ourselves
mhm,
in that way.
mhm,
This opportunity to learn and grow and also to eventually, contribute and offer. But I think that it's just a really disarming posture too. You're not. There's no agenda other than, hey, I just want to learn about you. You know.
mhm,
Um, yeah. So I think that's probably the biggest one as I reflect back on it. Of it. Yeah, that change in posture has dramatically impacted my life and every relationship that I've experienced since then, because I really feel like, gosh, I got a lot to learn, and there's opportunities everywhere for me to do that. So, yeah.
That's great. And just to dig a bit more into the Kenya culture for those that haven't had the experience of being as integrated and welcomed as you have. I'm thinking back on my own experiences with different cultures, and just to name a few things that come to mind. I spent some time in France, and there's so much you could say
Mm,
about culture and people, but somehow the memory that comes back to me of my time in France is how the dinners would be with my host families, and how they were these 3-hour long affairs that everyone would talk at once, and there'd be all these side conversations, and food just kind of seemed like an added. It didn't seem like we were coming down to eat dinner. It seemed like we were coming to have a 3-hour conversation, and we just happened to be eating through those 3 hours as we were talking. And that was a very different experience for
mm,
me as American, where you were focusing more on the food than the community or conversation. If I think about my time in
yeah.
Japan, one of the things, of course, there's many, many things to say, but just one thing that pops up about my how I've learned from Japanese culture and grown is in many conversations I would have with Japanese friends, there was just there could be a silence in the conversation that we didn't need to fill with words, where we could just have a break in talking, and we could both sit there and be comfortable with it. And I was extremely uncomfortable when I first arrived, because I felt like silence was always something you had to rush to fill. And over my years in Japan, I learned how to have conversations where there could just be periods of silence where no word needed to be said, and that was totally fine. When I think about my time in Myanmar, one of the things that comes to mind immediately is the generosity, just the selfless giving, the joyous giving, the joy in someone else's success or well-being, and the welcoming into just small acts of how one can be generous. And my experience in Myanmar was so tied, especially in the early days, of Burmese Buddhists, and so to me that giving went into it touched me deeply in the selflessness I was trying to achieve in meditation, and the lack of ego, and thinking of others before my own needs, and seeing my own selfishness laid bare. So these are examples of things I would think of in cultures that I had been to and spent time in, that stayed with me. So when you're thinking of your time in the Kenya culture, and for those that haven't really had those experiences, what would be characteristics or things that would come out as defining your experienced integration with Kenya community members and culture?
Mm. Man, first of all, I feel like we need to just flip the script and do a podcast episode on your story, because I didn't know in France and Japan. That's amazing. Gosh, so many things, so many beautiful traits and realities in the Kenya community. I think the one that just jumps out to me right away is the familiarity, the real like emphasis on family, and how that is not defined by blood.
Hmm.
In the Kenya language, and I'm sure that this is consistent in other languages as well, but it's different in English, or maybe in our American culture, that when you refer to someone, you call them by their name.
Hmm.
And so if I was talking to you, I'd say, "Hey, Joa," right?
Hmm.
But in the Kenya community and language and culture, you hardly use anyone's name. You would address someone as, "Hey, big brother," or
Right.
"Hey, little sister," "Hey, grandma," "Hey, grandpa." And I think that's just one kind of element of this real deep sense of family and connectedness that you feel when you interact with the Kenya people. And so I think, as you're talking about it, that sense of generosity, I think that that's also there in the Kenya community of, yeah, of course I'm going to share what I have with you, like your family, your big brother. And I think that has been such a really powerful and transformative thing for me, where now I've even, tried to integrate some of that language into my own context here, and try to refer to people as family when I can, or when it feels appropriate. So yeah, I think that's a big one. The other one is, man, Kenya people are hilarious, and they do not take themselves too seriously. Just radically humble,
Mhm.
and just deeply like respectable in their way of not having such big egos, and being willing to poke fun at themselves, or to be goofy. And even people with really really big jobs, or really really you know things that they're involved with being a big deal, when you meet them, they're just treat you like family, just treat you like you've been around since forever. And so I think that's been my experience. But I've also heard that that's pretty consistent with people that bump up to the Kenya community as well. So yeah, those are just a couple, but man, such beautiful, amazing people, no doubt.
And you referenced early in your story about sitting down and having Kenya food with them. So just have to ask, tell us a bit about Kenya food and some of your favorite dishes.
Oh gosh. Well, I think this is probably pretty cliche, but kana
Hmm.
is like a kind of like a fish soup, and it is just an absolute staple and so delicious. I think it's called mohinga
Hmm.
in Burmese,
Hmm.
and so I'm sure you've had it, and it's, dude, just absolutely fire.
Hmm.
So delicious, and I could eat bowl after bowl of that. Um, but gosh, I think some of my other favorites are. I love Boothija. I know that that's like also a pretty staple Burmese thing. Um, maybe, yeah, Joe. One thing I'm curious about: have you ever had palm wine
I don't
while you've been in
I
Myanmar?
don't drink alcohol, so I haven't.
Yeah. Have you ever seen it like in your travels at all?
I might have, but because I don't drink, I tend to not notice that part of
Yeah,
it. But I've definitely been around the just local people locally making their own liquor, just
yeah,
hearing about that and being around that, but I haven't really differentiated all that much.
yeah. Sure. Yeah. So in kind of like the middle to southern Kenya ancestral homeland, Gothule, they have these really beautiful big palm trees that produce this. I guess it would be called like a sap, I guess,
Hmm.
in the tree, and it ferments in the tree, and then they chop a branch and kind of pour out this
Oh
sap,
wow.
and um, it's this very kind of like fruity, earthy beer, and
Hmm.
it's not super high in alcohol, but um, enough to be dangerous if you're really getting after it.
Mm.
But it's just super tasty. So I think
Mm.
that that's another
Cool.
one that, yeah, it's just fun because when you're in a like a real traditional Kenya village, um, it's an indigenous reality.
Mm.
There's people that are very much living off the land, and
Hmm.
so some of the food that you get is just the bomb because it's so natural, and everything is kind of produced by the sweat and the hands of those in the village. So yeah, I think man, it's just the village life is the best, dude. So much fun, I could say. Yeah.
That's great. So moving along your story and kind of the touchstones that you mentioned in your introduction, you talk about writing a your senior thesis on the Karen Revolution in the post-war period. So this, of course, could be a whole podcast episode. It could be a whole podcast program with series of episodes. But I want to put you on the spot and just give you 10, 15 minutes, however you run through. And I'm sure there's some listeners who have some familiarity with the Karen Revolution. It rings a bell, or they know this or that. And I'm sure there's others listening that are like, "What's that? What's the Karen Revolution?" So, if you could just give us a
Mm,
synopsis of what happened, what it is, what's important about it, the legacy of it, or which I know is a hard thing to do for someone with so much knowledge about a certain topic to try to just
mm.
bring it to an extended summary. But if you could just touch upon the significance of the Karen Revolution, what you found as you studied it.
Boy, all right, folks. Well, strap in and take it with a real big grain of salt, as this is coming from a lily white guy in Minnesota who hasn't lived any of this story or reality. But I'll try to kind of reflect on some of what I've learned and how my experiences have driven some of that home. But um, gosh, I think it's important in this story to actually go back, pre uh, pre-colonial era even. I think the Kenya history is really beautiful, and it gets passed down. It's an oral history, and there's a word that the Kenya community uses to kind of describe some of the way that those stories are told, and that's ta. And ta is like kind of like poetry, but it also has this like deeper meaning and story. And so maybe for some who are out there listening, I won't go into the full story, but there's this really famous kind of folktale or origin story or ta that the Kenya community holds about a grandpa named Putamepa. And basically, there's a belief that the Kenya community was led from the Gobi Desert or Mongolia down the Salween River by this grandpa or elder in the community called Putamepa. And then sometime in there, there's a split where some of the Kenya people, I think the story goes that they get a little lost because they're behind Putamepa. And so they end up in the Delta area down by, what was Rangoon. And Putamepa continues down the Salween and ends up in what is probably, described now as the Karen state and or the Karen Hills in eastern Myanmar. And so, you get this kind of fascinating story there where there's these Western Po Kenya people, and then there's this Ska Karen or Kenya community that is kind of more east, and I won't get again too deep into the weeds, but there's other groups, and then of course Karenni folks as well in that mix. That Karenni is basically just means red Karen, and so the Karenni state, of course, is just a little bit north of where the current Karen state is. So anyway, I think starting there, it's then important to reflect on actually what was happening before the British colonized, and that was some fighting between these different kingdoms, and in particular these Burmese kingdoms and Thai kingdoms. And as these two kind of conflicting kingdoms would duke it out, they consistently would travel through Kenya land to get there. And so the Kenya people were used as porters and slaves, and there was never a real good conciliation or relationship between the Burmese communities or the Thai communities, and then of course the Kenya community. And so that's kind of the backdrop. Then as the British colonize, they connect really well with the Western Po Kenya people. That has a lot to do with the fact that a lot of those Kenya who were living in the Delta converted to Christianity. And the British found the Kenya people to be, humble and trustworthy and loyal. And then, of course, there was this connection between religion. And so many of the Karen were elevated into positions of power within the colonial government when it was established, as well as many, Kenya people were sent to England to go study. And so actually the leader of the Karen Revolution, when it started, was a gentleman named Sabah Uji. And Sabah Uji was a trained lawyer who attended Cambridge University and served in the colonial military as well. And so, again, kind of trying to breeze through what is a really complex history. And I want to be careful not to make too many generalizations, but I think a lot of people who are familiar with Myanmar are familiar with kind of the end of the colonial era and World War II. And so, it's kind of thought that the Burmese and more or less invited the Japanese and to kick out the British to end that colonial era. And then they realized that some way through that the Japanese were actually not there as liberators, but there as new colonizers. And so, that's the story of kind of then flipping and fighting against the Japanese. And so during that whole time, the Karen, or many of them, had aligned themselves with the British, particularly when the Japanese first invaded. And so, you now have Karen or Kenya people fighting against Burmese and Japanese people. And the British promised the Kenya people that at the end of World War II, when the dust settled, that the Karen people, Kenya people, would be given their ancestral homeland, and that the British would be an ally to this new country of Gathule. And of course, just with the complexities of what eventually ended up happening, where, I guess the broader Burmese started to fight against the Japanese and help kind of kick them out. And then a relationship, with the British again, things just got really convoluted, and that promise to the Kenya people was never fulfilled by the British. And so I think the end of the colonial era is just kind of fascinating, and how everything, ends up playing out. There's not a lot of ethnic representation at the table or at the kind of negotiations table between the British and then, those who would be establishing a new non-colonial country of Burma. And so the Karen people ended up starting this political organization known as the KNU. And the KNU really started as an advocacy group to try to get a seat at the table for some of these negotiations, and that never ended up coming to pass. And so, more or less skipping ahead, what happens is Burma's gained independence in 1947, and then there's 2 years of kind of some real serious tension between the Karen and Burmese, or kind of the new ruling government. And what ends up happening is there's a lot of discrimination against Karen people in the capital of Rangoon. And eventually there's some acts of violence against Karen people in Rangoon, or actually in this suburb of Rangoon called Insane. And so what happens is in January of 1949, there was kind of a indiscriminate killing of some Karen people in Insane. And so, Saba Uji, who was a part of the KNU, helped found the KNDO, which is the Karen National Defense Organization. And they armed themselves and started to fight back. And so there was really intense fighting in Insane and Rangoon for a period of time in early 1949. And what eventually happens is, there's a ceasefire agreement for a couple days, and during that time, the Burmese military ends up kind of positioning themselves surrounding this Ganya Karen revolution in Insane. And eventually they are, the peace talks dissipate and they're fighting again. And the Karen soldiers that were in Insane escaped Rangoon and Insane and eventually moved east into the Karen Hills. And so that fighting, that conflict has technically never been resolved. And that's why there are now, all sorts of literature and documentaries about this being the longest running civil war in the history of the world, because technically the KNU and Karen armies have not, given up or signed anything that would indicate kind of their relinquishment of their land. And so, that's kind of a real long but kind of short also reflection of some of that history. And boy, I hope that it made sense. But that's kind of my understanding of it. And there's obviously a lot more from 1949 on to where we sit now. But just you're right. We need a whole series, I think, to really knock out that one for sure. But
Well, we're working on that, so we'll see if we can bring that around. But that was great. And since you're on a roll, I want to put you on the spot again and have you keep going. As you mentioned, there's a lot more that happens after 49. I know that we were talking in person about what the current mindset is of the younger generation, ethnics, Bamar, Kenya, and how that relates to what the elders have been through and how the elders see things. And I think before we get to what this younger generation is thinking and doing in ways that are different, and how Urban Village and perhaps Insight Myanmar are respectively playing roles in trying to support this new way of looking things, to contrast the freshness and the newness that some of the young generation are looking at things now, we do have to better understand that contrast of how did their elders see things, what did their elders go through. And you just set the stage for something a couple generations ago. But to get a little more recent, up to the present day, before we get into the post-coup issues and the Kenya youth, both back there as well as here, and the ones you work with, if I could put you on the spot again and have you carry us through to the next several decades and whatever you want to touch upon. Obviously, it is impossible to, in a short amount of time, chart the insurgencies, the divisions, the different units that form, the controversies, the successes and failures. There's so much there. There's books that are trying to catalog it. It's incredibly complicated and confusing. But as someone who spent so much time with this community and also researching and writing and reading, talking about it, if you can just carry us through to something of the important things that then happen after 49, leading before the coup, just so we get a sense of better understanding the perspective and the history and the issues that are now defining how this current generation and their elders are responding in this moment.
Well, two things quickly. One, I do again. I want to drive home that these are largely my experiences and some of my readings, and I'm not a historian, so I'll do my best. But also, too, I definitely want to drive this home that
Mm,
I think probably some of the language that I'm using is going to be very broad and quite general. And
sure.
one thing that I want to definitely make a note of now is that as I've used even the word Burmese, that encompasses a really, really broad group. And I think as I've been referencing it, I'm really meaning more of like the I'm going to start using the term the Tatmadaw, which
Hmm.
maybe people will understand that is this that is the military of Myanmar now, or Burma. And so and there's kind of this the elite Burmese general ruling class, dominating class that is really behind pushing these buttons for the Tatmadaw. So I just want to start with that. But um, gosh, yeah. So I think maybe the next kind of milestone that would be important after the start of the Kenya Revolution in 1949 is that, uh, well, one, the Kenya Revolution was right off the bat actually really, really close to um, a completely different reality for Myanmar now.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Kenya military or KNDO at that time was colluding with other ethnic minority groups throughout the country, and at one point in time, the city of Tungu was completely controlled by the Kenya. Mandalay was controlled by uh, these rebel forces. There's actually a really wild story about kind of a jailbreak in Mandalay that led to the takeover of or the control of the city. But not to go into that here, just a fascinating story. So the next big milestone would be maybe in 62. And maybe folks who are familiar will remember that that's the first coup where Ne Win takes over the country. And there's just a general campaign of violence against, not just the Kenyan and Kearney folks, but other, ethnic minorities throughout the country. I think this is really when Burmanization started much longer before this period, but was really driven home during this time as well. Kenya people are not allowed to have school curriculum in their language. That's just an example of kind of the Burmanization. Many Kenya people who are living in the cities, um, if they went to a public school, they would need to change their name to a Burmese name. And so that's kind of just the one reality of Burmanization that has some pretty big and intense impacts. And so that's happening in 62. And then, of course, I think everyone is hopefully familiar with then what happens in 88. And of course, 88 is or before 88, it's the Saffron Revolution, and then leading up into the Student Revolution. And there's just such a really intense crackdown against, many of the Burmese ethnic majority who are demanding something new, something better, and access to education and to better kind of civil processes, and so that leads to this really violent crackdown, and a lot of the folks who are in the big cities who are leading these student revolutions end up fleeing, and where they end up fleeing to is into the Kenya Revolution. And so at that time, the Kenya people had, or the Kenya Revolution had a kind of like a home base or a capital, you could say, a focal point for the revolution known as Manor. And Manor is very close to the Thai border. It's in the Karen Hills of eastern Myanmar. And Manor actually translates to victory field. And so this was where, that pursuit of independence and overthrow of the this military regime was really being seeded and fostered and grown. And so that's where a lot of the 88 students who were very involved in kind of their own revolution end up in Manor. And there's this, really, in a lot of ways, beautiful broadening of the Kenya Revolution, where, there's delegates from different ethnic groups and representatives from these Burmese student unions, and there's just fertile soil for connection to kind of foster and flourish and broaden this idea of revolution in the country. And so, of course, the Tatmadaw were really intentional about wanting to stamp out this kind of city in which the revolution is stemming from. And so it takes a handful of years, but in 95, Manor eventually falls. And in a lot of ways, since 95, the Kenya Revolution has looked a lot more spread out, a lot more, kind of thinner, but scrappier in a lot of different ways. And so that kind of leads us to the last two milestones on this journey, being the NCA agreement in 2015. And so in 2015, it was kind of a controversial move, but the leaders of the KNU at that time signed an official, ceasefire agreement, national ceasefire agreement, NCA, with the Tatmadaw. And there's a period of, peace in Kothule, or in the Karen state, between the Karen Revolutionary Forces and the Tatmadaw. And, I think it's important to mention that there's a lot happening in the country at this time. If, people are aware, there's a pretty big election that happened. And there was a lot of hope, I think, for some real changes to take place. And unfortunately, that really never came to pass, as we're all probably well aware. On February 1st of 2021, the Tatmadaw once again took over the country and really have been intentional and violent in their stamping out of hopes for something new and for revolution. And that's kind of where we find ourselves, is in this place now where, the entire country is really fighting back. And I think this type of unity probably hasn't been seen before, but definitely not since '88 and kind of the fallout of some of that time period where people are really looking across ethnic divisions and traditional divides and trying to work together to overthrow this military regime. And so, yeah, the Kenya Revolution is on its 73rd year, but soon to be 74th. And I guess there's a real, I think, feeling of hopefulness and optimism in what some of the, this new unity is providing, but also I think just a very sad and depressing reality of what it's taking to get there. And I know that probably many who are listening to this podcast are familiar with what I'm talking about, but just the indiscriminate bombings and killings of civilians all over the country. It's certainly a hopeful but a dark time in Myanmar. And so, yeah, I think that kind of brings us up to speed. What did I miss?
Yeah, thanks for that. That's great. That's another great run through of a lot of years. There's just one thing I wanted to ask you about in that time and get your thoughts on the significance of. That's the Buddhist Karen split of the
Yeah.
Karen community.
Mm. Yeah, and so that's a really fascinating kind of part of this story is that the real reason for the fall of Manarpla is a division that happens between Kenya Christians and Kenya Buddhists in the Karen or Kenya Armed Forces. And so kind of the way that the story goes is a lot of the leaders or top brass in the Kenya military were Christians. They kind of came from that line of connection to the British, and their proximity to the British and the British military equipped them well to be military leaders. But their religion, I think made them a little different from maybe just the everyday soldier. And so, there's, I think some feelings of mistreatment from the Kenya Buddhist soldiers to some of the top brass who are identifying as Christian. And the Tatmadaw, I think, were able to recognize this, and they leveraged it. And so they started kind of fueling discord and, placing different kind of spies in different places and paying different operatives to kind of fan the flame of discord between those two communities. And what eventually ends up happening is there's a split. There's a split in the Kenya Armed Forces. And there's what's called the KNDO and KNLA split. And what came out of them was a group called the DKBA. And that group was instrumental in kind of giving up the area and tactical kind of advantage in the fall of Manarpla. And so it's just a really interesting and unfortunate division that has since, I think, kind of taken on itself in different ways now today. But I also think that there's a lot of healing that has gone on since then. And again, I think people are starting to recognize the way that the Tatmadaw, and particularly the military leaders of the Tatmadaw, just don't actually have a stake in any religion or Buddhist unity. They kind of just want to leverage what they can to maintain control and power. And so I think people are really becoming more and more aware and in tune with that. So
Right. Yeah. Thanks for that. And if you can clarify something else that might have sprung out of this split, you mentioned the DKBA. There's also these border guard forces, which I
mm,
believe are in Kenya State. Can you share what you know about them and how this might be related?
yeah, so again, I'm not a historian on this, but based on my understanding, there's even kind of another split within the DKBA that eventually leads to this new group known as the Border Guard Force. And um, this is again a largely Karen military. The Border Guard Force is, at least in this area of the Karen state. And there's all sorts of now different stories and understandings and beliefs about how the Border Guard Force is really and more of a business than it is a military, in that there's all
Mm,
these economic and financial deals with Chinese businesses and casinos and drugs and man, kind of anything that you can think of. It seems like there's a hand in some of that from this group. And so yeah, that's kind of the origins, though, is that it stems from this religious split in the Kenya Revolution.
right. Thanks. So that brings us up to today and gives us just a general overview of where we are in the last 2 years. Before getting to how the younger Generation Z, both here and as well as in Myanmar, have been carrying this forward, let's understand their elders and
Mm.
given the history that you explained, how they have come to see this current conflict, and from your understanding of those you've talked to, as well as third person, those you've talked to who've explained some of the leadership and some of the views of the elders. This is a time of revolution. It's been going on nearly 2 years now, and it is, and with all things revolution in history, everything has the potential of being shaken up. New ideas, good and bad, can come out and be examined, and the way forward and the ground is very unclear. But what is your understanding of some of the elders and leaders in the Kenya community, how they see this time since the coup, what they've been doing, and what their motivation and their goals are?
Oh boy, man, Joe, I think, gosh, again, this is a tough question to answer, and I think
Mm, mm,
largely, again, largely because I have no right to answer it.
right,
um,
right.
I think uh, there's a saying that anything without us, or anything about us without us, is not for us, and so I want to definitely tread carefully as I
Sure.
attempt to just share some of my experience. But um, I think it one thing that I can share, particularly just because of my experience here in Minnesota amongst the diaspora, is that um, yeah, man, there's a lot of trauma. Um,
Hmm.
there's a real lived um, pain that stems from a lot of years of intense violence and human rights violations. There's not a Ganya person in Minnesota who doesn't have a story about
Yeah.
a family member or a friend, being harmed, raped, killed,
Mm,
tortured,
mm,
um, or a village burned, and people being used as porters. And
mm,
gosh, there's so much trauma in this community based on real violence that they've experienced. And I think the truth is, that um, trauma makes it really difficult to imagine uh, repair, to imagine
Mhm.
now, there's amongst the youth in Myanmar, I think, there's a real acknowledgement of uh, the ethnic struggle now,
Mhm.
um,
Mhm.
which is new. And I'm not sure that the elders within the diaspora are ready to trust it or forgive it, or
Mhm.
forgive what happened. Um, and the youth of the diaspora, I think, are much more willing to embrace this moment and see the unity, uh, the opportunity for unity and for a new reality moving forward. But um, the elders are skeptical, and I think it's understandable. It's based on real experiences that they have, and yeah. So I think that would kind of be my answer, in regards to my perception of where I see some of the elders within this community at. Um, yeah, I think it's hard for them to imagine um, working with or supporting a PDF group in Mandalay.
Mhm.
It's
Mhm.
much more um, acceptable to really focus on supporting, the KNLA and the KNU. So yeah, I think that's. I don't know if that answers your question, but
Mm. Yeah, yeah, absolutely, and I appreciate the sensitive ground and respect
mm,
how careful you're being and trying to describe your understanding of different voices that eventually we hope to have on as well to get
yeah,
those perspectives directly.
mhm,
I think it's really valuable hearing about the background of these elders, the mistrust, the trauma, the things that happened that have them looking a bit more skeptically. I think it's really important to understand not just how they think, but why they think that way, where it came from,
mm,
and then how they're approaching this current moment given their understanding and their lived experience in these other times. Moving now to the younger generation, which we've just touched upon lightly in terms of
mhm,
their this younger generation seeing things differently, wanting something different, perhaps having a bit more idealism and open to the moment, which
mm,
those who've been through that may label as naivete. One
yeah.
doesn't know until this plays out. But how would you, going a bit deeper into this younger generation with whom you're very connected to, I understand, both in the country and here, what are you hearing from them? What are they expressing about this current moment and what they want and what they hope for?
Oh boy, man. I mean, I think there's some really cool things going on right now. I think first and foremost, one thing that we're really seeing here, particularly amongst the Kenya community in Minnesota, is uh, a real intense reclamation of identity. I think that with the coup in Myanmar, and maybe again this opportunity that it presents, um, a lot of youth are I think hopeful and motivated that for the first time, the Karen or Kenya people will be recognized. The labor of their ancestors for 73, almost 74 years, and even prior of this um, journey towards self-determination, that it will be acknowledged. And I think that there's a real hope, and I think that it's really igniting a new sense of unity, even within the Kenya people, that this is a moment where there's a chance that if we come together, we can secure recognition and self-determination for our people, which they've never had. And so I think it is just a really amazing time to see the way that people are coming together around that opportunity. Um, yeah, I think that's a big one. And then the other thing is, I think what's different, from 2021 to from 88 is social media. Now
Mhm.
the diaspora community is getting updated moment by moment of what is
Yeah.
happening to their people. Um, and they're spreading it, they're sharing it, and they're including people like you and I, and asking and
Mhm.
hoping for allyship and accompaniment as they uh, try to serve their people back home. And so I think that's a really different thing right now, and that organizing and sharing information has never been that easy, or this easy, and that's playing a big role in how I think the youth, especially as savvy as they are with social media, they're leveraging it on behalf of their people.
Mm. That's interesting. That's great to hear. Getting at this identity issue and this 72, 73-year revolution and insurgency that's taken place that has transformed the lives, uprooted the lives of a whole community around the world, and many of whom have come to your home state in Minnesota. I wonder what you've learned about those in the community, how they've come to understand or reconcile their identity, because Manor Plothvale and their many Kenya villages have been burned and destroyed over many years, many generations, and have been terrorized. The trauma. Many have spent time in IDP camps in Thailand or in Myanmar, and then many have resettled
Mm.
in various places around the world. Certainly, many in Minnesota, where there's a huge population. I think the biggest population outside of Southeast Asia, and so there's this tenuous identity of the younger generation being born into something that is over 7 decades old and trying to understand who they are as they're displaced and grow up displaced and take on some part of the identity of that culture. And yet they also have the culture of their community. And then outside of their community, they come from a larger country where they're an ethnic minority. So these are a lot of diverse and complicated identity issues to sort out. And I learned just a little bit about the complexity involved in this when we met when in person when I was there in Minnesota, and just taking in how layered and complicated these identity issues were. So, how have you come to understand how people in the Kenya community, whether they're here, there, or somewhere in between, how they've come to understand which group they belong to and how they identify?
Boy, that's a man, Joe. That's a big question. I think
Hmm.
the reality is that there's a lot of diversity in people's understanding of their identity, as there should be. Um, I think kind of the word that we might be dancing around is intersectionality. Um, what
Hmm.
comes, uh, what's kind of the hierarchy of how you define your identity? Are you Kenya? Are you Buddhist? Are you American? Are you straight? Like what comes first, and all the different kind of intersections that people have to navigate. I will say that I think, again, as it kind of relates to what's happening back in Myanmar right now, I just want to speak a little bit to this reclamation of identity, to where I'm going to share a story, and I won't share this person's name, but I have just a real beloved friend, brother, um, who, as he's Ganya, and he talks about his experience growing up. Was he actually grew up, in the refugee camp, and then was able to go to a Thai school that was near the refugee camp. And, while he was at Thai school, he had to kind of assume a Thai identity in order to fit in and really to be treated well. And then eventually he's resettled in New York. And when he's in New York, he's one of the first Ganya people there. And he's going to school, and people are asking him, where are you from? And this guy goes on to share that he's from Thailand. And I think after the first couple times, he starts to realize that, man, it's just so much easier, rather than identifying yourself as Karen, where most people will say, "Oh, you're Korean," you know, um, that
Right.
he would actually just identify himself as Thai. And I think he kind of went on to share to me that he felt ashamed. He felt
Mm,
ashamed to be identified as a refugee, as someone who was stateless, who didn't have a land. And so he grew up really his entire early years and into high school, and then eventually college, just telling people he was Thai. Um,
mm,
and I think, you know, again, the proximity that social media has created to the conflict in Myanmar uh, has, in this individual in particular, uh, I think it ignited a sense of like, you know what? I do have a land. Like, I do have a people that are my own. I do have a history and a culture that's worth reclaiming, because there's people that are fighting and dying to reclaim it, and or to stake it, um, to value it as not lesser than but equal to, you know. And so I think,
right.
um, yeah, for them, they have just completely, uh, yeah, I think done a 180 in terms of now they are leading, co-leading an organization um, that is actually called IMP, and is really
Mm,
spreading this this feeling of reclamation. The desire to be valued as Ganya, um, not to be called Karen, uh, but to be referred to as Ganya and to be seen as equal, you know. And it's just beautiful. It's really been a special thing, especially here at the Urban Village, to be a part of that movement, to help, in a lot of ways, programmatically and logistically in that movement. And yeah, it's just a cool thing to witness and to be a part of.
yeah, and that segues perfectly into Urban Village. I want to spend a bit more time with
Mm,
that, with just an amazing organization, very unique in terms of your mission and what activities you're doing, what your programs are. Can you take us through? You mentioned earlier in your brief introduction just how you found a bar that was for sale on your street, and you decided to renovate it and
mhm,
turn it into a space for Urban Village to be able to do things with. Talk us through Urban Village's mission, activities, who you're working with, what you're doing, who's coming in, just the whole gamut, because you guys do such amazing, wonderful work.
mm. I appreciate that, Joe. Well, again, I think in a lot of ways, as I reflect on the story, the urban village was kind of the cart before the horse, if you will, in that we
Mm.
we acquired this space even before we had a plan of what we were going to do with it.
Mhm.
We had just kind of heard, and I think folks who would eventually become founding board members had been saying for a long time that we just don't have a Kenya space. Like, we don't have a a space that feels like ours. Our schools are diverse, our churches are rented, our temples are rented. There's just there wasn't a feeling of this is a place that we can call our own, or there is a place to call our own. And so we started there. We really, in the renovation process, just reached out to uh, really friends that we have had for a long time in the community who are artists, and uh, just kind of took a hold of the space, and we said, hey, you have free reign to make this place feel like home. Make it feel like this is a Kenya and Karenni space. And so what ended up happening is, I think, kind of first and foremost, we became this unofficial art gallery, where we, opened up our space for all of the artists in the community to come display their art. And then it kind of morphed from there into getting more creative with the space itself, and trying to. I think you saw we have like a wall that we've covered in bamboo to try to kind of reflect what Ganya home feels like in his
Mm.
village. And we have like a thatched roof, and
Right.
a bunch of artifacts and things that just now kind of feel like, yeah, this is a Ganya and Karenni space. And so that's where we started, and I think what we've since kind of grown into, and really understanding our unique work within the community, is in this emerging generation. I think you know we're we're hearing from elders a genuine fear around a growing disconnect between them and their kids. And I think a lot of that stems from the realities of I think what's more commonly described as being a third culture kid. Growing up, um, having Kenya parents who are fully Kenya speaking, who dress and act and eat fully like they did back in the refugee camp, or in back in Kothule. Um, and then you're in their home and you're experiencing that as a child, but you're going to school and you're experiencing broader American culture. And I think that kids end up with this like confusion around, I don't feel quite Kenya or Karenni enough, but I don't feel quite American enough, whatever that means. But I think um, then they kind of find themselves in this third space of kind of bouncing in between. And I think we've seen how that leads to some deep feelings of disenfranchisement and not being understood really by anybody. And so we've kind of taken it upon ourselves here at the Urban Village to just generally speaking be a space for those kids. And our mission again is to accompany these youth as they connect, heal, and launch. And our hope is that that connection really starts with a connection to themselves, a connection to their identity, whatever they come to believe that to be, but that they feel a sense of connection. I think hosting our programs in the urban village actually provides a really cool opportunity for that, where, you know, these young kiddos who've, you know, they were even born here in the US, or they don't remember time in Thailand or Myanmar. They look around and they see, you know, art that depicts a Kenya village, and they're curious, you know, and they get to learn about what everyday life is like in that village just by viewing that painting. And I think it offers an opportunity for connection to uh, more deep, oneself more deeply. And so that's a big part of what we do. We host a summer camp that really focuses on exploring the concept of identity and intersection in identity. We've called that Ganya Camp. So we're really excited about our second year of that coming up next summer. And then, you know, we do a variety of different programs that are oriented towards healing. I think a lot of the Kenya and Karenni youth have experienced some traumas, you know, secondary trauma from their parents. But, you know, resettlement is it's not always a smooth process. Like it is can be deeply traumatic. And so we try to create space to unpack some of those wounds and just safely embark on a journey of healing, and doing that around and with people who can relate and understand. And so, I think that those two kind of lead up to our last missional pillar, which is launch. And so we believe that a more connected and a youth who's on a journey of healing is prepared for a more robust launch. And I think for us, that looks like just being good listeners at the urban village and hearing, okay, where do you want to go? Like, what are your dreams? What do you want to do with your life? And providing support to get there. So we have some after school programs. We have a scholarship program. We have a fiscal sponsorship program. And then kind of just ultimately and generally, we're down to be a part of dreams of young people in this community. And so we're hopeful that leads to a podcast collaboration with Insight Myanmar. But I think the opportunities are varied, and we just want to be along for the ride wherever these youth want to go.
That's great to hear. Another initiative I learned about when I was there, maybe you can go into, is this history initiative of getting these histories of individuals all over the Kenya community. And then I don't know if this is part of the same project or it's a different project. You can clarify that.
Yeah.
But because there's such a large Kenya population in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, then working with local schools so that in the public schools, their history classes actually have a Kenya component, so that these third culture, as you say, individuals are able to learn about their own history in school. So can you break down those two initiatives, or if they're part of the same one, and what you're doing with that?
Yeah. So that's we're calling it our Kenyan Karenni Historical Archive. And so basically, this is a youth-led archive where we're trying to accompany and empower youth with the tools to go out and collect the stories that they want to hear from elders in their community. And ultimately, we will take those and kind of piecemeal them together with, you know, some other books and timelines and photos that we've had access to now. And that will become a free and accessible online archive. And our hope is that as that archive continues to develop, then we'll be a part of the process, like you said, in partnering with local schools to develop curriculum, to say this is, hey, this is how you can teach and understand, Kenya and Karenni history. And and we hope that is not just education that Kenya and Karenni students will receive, but that our broader community will get to explore and learn about, and really relish in the just deeply beautiful and complex and nuanced history of these two incredible communities. So yeah, that's kind of a part of our uh, connect programming that we're in the midst of continuing to develop right now. But we're hopeful that that's gonna eventually be a real staple, and just kind of our gift to our broader Minnesota community, even national community, for
Mm.
educators to get a hold of and to put into their curriculums.
Yeah, that is so cool. That is really neat what you're doing, and yeah, definitely we hope that podcast program can take off. Stay tuned to this account as well as Urban Village to see developments if we when and how we get that off the ground. I think it's interesting. You're from Minnesota, and as we've mentioned, there's this enormous Kenya community there. Also, other ethnicities from Myanmar are found in in Minnesota. I know there's a lot of Mun as well,
Yeah.
as well as immigrants from other communities. What is your understanding why Minnesota became the place where so many Kenya came to live and to settle? And what can you take us through a virtual description of if one were to come chance upon the Kenya uh, districts of St. Paul,
Mhm.
what they'd find and what the experience would be there?
Mm. Yeah, boy, that's a good question. Well, I think it's so I think it's really obvious that the Kenya people came because the weather is so similar to what they experienced back in Myanmar. That's completely a joke. No, it's a pretty
Yeah, right.
pretty harsh. It's a harsh reality check for, I think, many families as they've resettled in Minnesota, because it's certainly a 180 as it comes to weather and climate. But Minnesota has a really robust infrastructure for refugee resettlement. So there are five kind of big organizations that are based out of Minnesota that do refugee resettlement. And so those have, I think, with more and bigger organizations, you get just the opportunity for housing more people. And so I think that's kind of what has led to Minnesota having the highest or the largest Hmong community, largest Somali community, and now largest Kenya and Karenni communities anywhere outside of Southeast Asia. Um, so yeah, that's been a really, I think it's a cool thing about Minnesota, but I also think it's important to note that where there's a robust um, process for resettlement, I think there's some real work to be done on equity within Minnesota. I think Minnesota has some pretty large gaps in education and income inequality as it pertains to um, race and socioeconomic status. And so I think it's awesome that there's so many folks that have come here to call Minnesota home, but um, I don't want to revel in that too long until we acknowledge that, hey, there's a lot of work that Minnesota can continue to do to actually not just a welcoming place, but a place where
Mhm.
these communities can come and thrive. So I think, yeah, I'd be remiss to not share that. But I mean, with that being said, it's really cool to be a part of this community here in East St. Paul. And, it's estimated that there's like 20,000 Kenya folks just in the St. Paul area. And then there's more as
Mhm.
you go outside of the Twin Cities. But, um, you know, you can go to Kenya grocery stores here, and
Mm.
you can have a Kenya realtor. You can get insured by a Kenya agent. I think most things here uh, that you would need to do in Minnesota, you can do in Kenya if you need to. And I think that that's just what's kind of cool as I am able to reflect on it. There's Kenya restaurants and Kenya grocery stores, so folks are able to I think live into their cultural realities in a more kind of vibrant way here in Minnesota because of the amount of folks that are here, and then of course the work that the community has put in to be able to establish those things. And it's really exciting to be a part of that, particularly as the urban village. Uh, and we get to, support and cheer on a lot of these different, businesses and entrepreneurs and folks that are doing some cool things within the community
Mm.
here in St. Paul. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's really neat. When I was there, you referenced the grocery stores and restaurants and visited some of those. Your urban village was quite generous to treat me to a lunch when I was there, and it was delicious food, and showed me some of the murals that were in that part of St. Paul. Just really cool to see Kenya-inspired murals in the downtown, and just riding the metro around Minneapolis and St. Paul, just realizing that one of the 6 languages or so of instructions was Kenya script, which blew me away. Took pictures of that, just seeing that representation and assistance that's there, and then and seeing how it thrived. I spoke to one Kenya man who had spent, I think, 14 years in a refugee camp, and when he came, he had the choice of coming to New York City or St. Paul, and he had some contacts in New York that had some opportunities for him, and of course, New York City is New York City, but he came to St. Paul instead because the bubble of that community was so special and precious to him, to want to help the youth and have peers and friends and be an active member of the community. It's like nothing else, and that's saying something when you're talking about New York City. New York City definitely has opportunities and populations, but that's it. That's what it has. It has those limited experience of certain holidays or restaurants or activities here or there, whereas in St. Paul, it's a thriving community, interactive, dynamic community members who are defining themselves and doing new things. And so he wanted to settle there and live his life there, to be able to stay within that community and help support that growth. And that was also gave me an insight, and was really cool to hear. Just to give a little bit of an anecdote too, to set you up, you had mentioned that many of the Kenya girls who are in high school take to volleyball. And so high school volleyball matches across the city become these Kenya celebratory events that everyone attends, and they bring their own cultural practices and understanding of that. So describe a bit about what those volleyball matches are like. That sounds so cool. I really would have loved to attend one of those.
Oh gosh, dude. Well, you're gonna have to come back because
Yes, yes.
it's a whole vibe. And
Yeah,
um, gosh, not just volleyball. I mean, it's yeah. Of course, I think a lot of people recognize cane ball or takraw,
right.
soccer, of course, and yeah, it's amazing that a lot of the local high schools. I mean, they'll have almost a full Kenya and Karenni team. Even though there's other communities that are represented at the school as well. But these end up being like crosstown showdowns of of the different uh, Stark and Yaw athletes, which is just really incredible to see. And then, of course, there are outside of high school and college locally. There's a super robust league of both volleyball and soccer, and kind of a circuit of tournaments that happen locally and then also nationally. And so, when we host Ginya Martyrs Day here in Minnesota, there will be teams for both volleyball and soccer that will travel from San Diego, from New York, from Georgia. I mean, all over, which is just really, really cool to see. But it's definitely true that St. Paul is kind of the cultural nexus amongst the Kenya community, the Kenya diaspora community here in the U.S. Yeah, it's really fun to be a part of it. That's for sure.
Right. So I also understand you referenced before how you went into Kenya State or early in your journey, and after spending a lot of time here in the community in Minnesota, and then wanting to go back and live in villages for an extended period of time, and how transformative that was. And I know that you've kept up your practice of continuing to make these visits, and even since the coup happened, I know you went last year, and you're going again this year. I'm not sure exactly when this interview will come out, so it might be coming out when you're already there or when you've come back. But if you could share a bit about what your experiences was like last year, going at a very different and volatile time in the history and the conflict, and what your plan and your goal is going this time around.
Yeah, so folks will remember February 1st, 2021, as when the coup, most recent coup, began, and ever since then, just the violence has continued to ratchet and ratchet and ratchet, and so there's just been tons of displacement of Kenya and Karenni civilians, and not just Kenya and Karenni, but all over the country of Myanmar. And I think, I heard the other day there's up to 2 million people that are displaced now. And so I think, organizationally for us at the Urban Village, it's so important that we listen to our diaspora community, to what the needs in the community are, and then really fall in line in as far as our service goes. And when the coup began and when the violence was ratcheting up, really what the diaspora community was telling us is, hey, we need a place to organize. We need a place to fundraise, because we'd really like to do something about this. We'd like to help our community back home who are impacted by this violence. And so we helped raise a bunch of funds, and eventually our team went over for the first time in April 2021, and then again in December 2021. And the main focus of those trips were basically trying to bring as much relief and supplies to folks who have been displaced as possible, while in the meantime being really intentional about trying to bring a spirit of joy and love and compassion and solidarity to the people who are most impacted by this violence. And so our team would travel around and put on little, fun concerts and games and, talent shows all over the Kenya territory, as a way to just, defiantly bring some joy and a break from the fear that I think is collectively felt across the country. So, yeah, that's been important to us. It's been just an incredible blessing, and we're gonna continue to do it as long as the reality of violence and displacement exists in Myanmar.
That's quite a thing to do, and as you're going in, you're witnessing and experiencing the reality, of what's happening with your own eyes, and I'm sure you have your own safety issues that you have to take into consideration, and so I wonder if you could bring a bit of your eyewitness account and experiences from last year's visit, and as well as speak a little bit generally, so you don't give away any details that would not be safe, but what precautions you're taking and how you're planning this year's visit.
Oh, yeah. I mean, cautiously for sure. I think the most important thing for us is that we are going in a spirit of solidarity. And so, if at any point our presence doesn't make people safe, or isn't helpful, then we don't want to be there. And so, right now, and there has been some pretty serious airstrikes that have happened in these areas, and I think,
Mm,
um, yeah, it's a difficult thing to be prepared for if you haven't experienced it before, and it's something that you need to be very intentional about. Uh, you know, your preparedness if it happens. And so for us, that's something that we are intimately in tune and connected with folks who are on the ground.
mhm.
We're trying to mitigate all those risks and not bring too much attention to what we're doing. But also, we believe that uh, this solidarity is worth our lives. We're there in full acknowledgement and understanding of the risks, because we genuinely feel like these are our family, these are our friends, these are our neighbors, and they're worthy of our solidarity. And if that puts us in harm's way, so be it. But that's, I think, the resolve, and that doesn't mean that we're taking crazy, unnecessary risks, but it does mean that we acknowledge the reality of what's happening around us, and will, and continue to have a presence.
Yeah, that's quite powerful. We wish you all the best of safety and of the support and aid you're able to give. It's really inspiring and amazing to hear about the lengths that you're going to, not just here, but over there, to stand by and to be an ally, and using your words, not just an ally where you're standing and benefiting others, but how to what degree you're opening yourself to that culture and those people, and that
Mm,
it's not just reciprocal, but something that you are saying time and again, and since I've known you and on this interview, how this interaction and experience has made you a better person, and how it's had you grown. So it's just it's so inspiring and beautiful to
mm,
hear these stories, and to have a chance to have you open up and be able to share what your experience has been like, and how these interactions have shaped you as well.
yeah. Man, absolutely. I think if I can just drive that home, it's been the absolute best gift I've ever received, is to be in connection to the Kenya and Karenni and other ethnic folks from Myanmar. It's been the absolute privilege of my life, and it's a complete joy and honor to be able to be so intimately connected,
Mm.
and in such a reciprocal relationship with them. So,
Yeah, and I think
yeah.
it's also so valuable hearing these stories, because I think when you just hear the headlines about the news covering Myanmar for now in the past years and decades, it's just just one pitiful or pathetic story after another of what of the violence and the economy and
Mm,
the lack of opportunity and everything that's going on there. And as you know, as I've spoken to some of my Burmese friends in America who are pursuing different vocations in art or in other kinds of fields, they say that, you know, when they travel and they travel to especially around Southeast Asia, and they tell people that they're Burmese, they get comments about their housekeeper or nanny being Burmese, or about
mm,
the immigrants that work in this factory or do this kind of thing, or the in some places the refugee camps where they are. And so this kind of image and connotation is something that unfortunately has pervaded and has made it seem like this is a place where just a series of unfortunate things happen, and it's something to be pitied. And I think one of the things that we really try to push back against in these podcast conversations is what a giver Myanmar is, whether
mm,
that's a giver in terms of the many of the people I talk to, the meditation and the practice and the monasticism, and how those people are just welcomed and embraced and brought into the spiritual practice, or whether it's hearing your story of you coming and thinking that you had something to offer and then realizing that you were actually the recipient, and that
mm,
these people in this foreign land, you've talked about how difficult displacement can be, and what and then the trauma that they're carrying, and yet and then of course how different the weather is, and then coming in there and still looking for a way to be a giver. And so I think that, as for those that are listening and that tune into this, I think that's something that we really tried to hit, are those many, many stories out there that just break down this narrative that occurs through these main headlines of a one dynamic that's seeming to characterize the country in really unfair and inaccurate ways. And there's so many stories that can poke the edges of that and show its fallacy and its reductionist, simplistic view. And I think yours is a great one of how much you're doing, and yet as much as you've done, as much as your life has been centered and oriented around being of service to this community, you express it as someone who is fortunate to have come in contact with them, and someone whose life has been shaped by the good privilege of being able to come into contact with this community, and how much it's done for you, how much you've learned. And so your giving is almost is the way I hear it and understand it. Your giving is a giving back.
mm.
It's an expression of gratitude, or of giving what you can, an acknowledgement of what you've received, having been open to this community in a way that maybe your local community or culture hasn't quite that same quality or series of qualities. And so I think it's very important to be able to bring these stories out that show the country and the people not as deserving sympathy or aid or help or any of those things, which of course they do, especially at this time, but as this reciprocal quality of when we open up to members of this community and culture, that how much our own lives as two of us talking to Americans who would consider ourselves allies of the people and culture, when we open up uh, to this people in these communities, how much it can offer and enrich our lives. And so I really appreciate hearing that part of your story.
Oh man, wow! It's cool to be in conversation with people who I think hold that same perspective,
Hmm.
and not a perspective, just acknowledge that reality, because it's so true, man. I think you and I can both attest to how indebted we are to these communities,
Hmm.
and boy, as I think about it, you know, they got the raw end of the deal where I got a community and a loving family and a house and a career and a place to travel to and experiences, and they got ugly, hairy white dude. So I think that's
Mm,
yeah, man, that's the truth, and you know it too. And I think it's just such a honor and blessing to be connected to you too, my friend, and
mm,
to be a part of this movement that you're creating and developing, that has such a beautiful mission of, like you said, beating down those stereotypes and acknowledging that, man, Myanmar is so much more than
yeah.
a military coup. And there's so much to be received and acknowledged, that there is to gain from connection and relationship to these amazing people. So it's good stuff, Joe.
Yeah, and I think also what I've learned from your story and your examination of history, I think I realized this somewhat before, but it didn't quite jump out the way you expressed it, was looking at the Korean Revolution, the post-war era and on, just the vagaries of history and how the problem with history is that we already know what happened. That's an expression that I've heard historians say. I'm probably butchering it, but something along those lines, that the problem with history is that because we know what turned out, kind of that's the only story we think that could have happened. That's the one thing that happened, and so that's how we learn about what defined an era. And I think for anyone who's studied the post-war era, it's you see the potentialities of so many different groups and motivations and goals for the end state that are are all in this boiling pot together, and we just had the one outcome of the Tatmadaw taking control and holding control viciously until present day. That's the history we know, so that's all we know, if unless we look a little carefully. But if you were to unpack those small micro moments, and even not so micro moments from those years, you see how much that established history just hangs on this thread, and how easily things could have developed down another path if it was just a couple of things going differently. And that's true of really any place or any time of seeing how it just takes a certain exact conditions to give rise to what ends up taking place, and to bring that understanding to where we are now, that this is a a 72, 73-year old insurgency, as you've described, civil war. And this is a unique time. As terrible and as awful as this is a unique time to give rise to a different set of potentialities. And as that younger generation are looking at it not as a zero-sum game, and not as a way to rigidly define and protect their own group, but in this extraordinary
Mm.
idealistic way that are not just words, but we're seeing them double down with that, with actions, and with actions where they're putting themselves directly at risk, or they perhaps might not be in the country and at risk, but they're sacrificing so much of their time and activities and income and everything else to be able to give all to this movement. That this is we're sitting at another juncture that has the potentiality to move in these different directions, and every one of us matter. Every one of our
Mm.
actions and our voices matter, and they might matter in big ways, such as taking a trip across the border as you are to be able to help communities there and bring back their stories. There might be smaller things that people can do: a donation, a conversation with someone from an immigrant community, reading the news, or listening to a podcast like this. There are any number of ways to contribute to that momentum that will hopefully lead to one of those greater potentialities starting to manifest at this critical time when we really do have that possibility.
Man, that is the truth, brother. And I hope that, man, I hope that folks will engage this moment for what it is, and recognize, as you mentioned, the potentiality of where we're at, not just
Mm,
in the creation of a new and brighter future for the people of Myanmar, but as an opportunity to posture ourselves as learners,
yeah.
to engage each other as family, and ultimately to contend for each other, as this global village, not just the urban village, but as a global village. And so, Man, we're in a fascinating and critical time, Joa, and
Yeah.
I'm super hopeful, and I draw hope from the young
Mm.
members of this community, and I believe that there is a brighter future, not just for Myanmar, but for our global village as well.
That's wonderful. It's wonderful. It's great to get a chance to talk with you and bring your voice out to a wider community. And before we close, are there any final thoughts or things you want to leave us with?
Oh man, just a deep sense of gratitude to you for this platform, and as I said, a call and a hope that those who are listening would get proximate to someone who doesn't look like them, someone who comes from a completely different reality, and posture yourself as a listener, and then go from there. And so, if you're, aligned with where we hope Myanmar is headed, then I would pray and urge you to sit at the feet of folks in the diaspora or folks who are directly in Myanmar, and posture yourself in a way that you can learn and become an ally, a friend, and maybe even family with these amazing folks. So thank you again, Joa. Appreciate you, young man, and we'll connect soon, I'm sure.
I'll be honest, not only is asking for donations my least favorite thing in the world to do, I find it pretty uncomfortable as well. Yet, it is an unavoidable but necessary task in order to ensure that our platform can continue to bring you stories from post-coup Myanmar. And unfortunately, the truth of the matter is that there is a basic minimum cost to keep our engine humming. So please allow me to take a moment for that least favorite and uncomfortable thing to do, and ask sincerely for your generosity in supporting our mission. If you found value in today's show and think others might as well, we ask that you take a moment to consider supporting our work. Thank you for taking the time to hear our spiel. And with that, it's off to work on the next episode. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go on to support a wide range of humanitarian and media missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, refugee camps, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects, as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution to a specific activity or project you would like to support, perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause, and both websites accept credit card. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we can take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either website for specific links to these respective accounts or email us at info@betterburma.org. That's Better Burma, one word, spelled BETTERBURMA.org. If you would like to give it another way, please contact us. We also invite you to check out our range of handicrafts that are sourced from vulnerable artisan communities across Myanmar, available at alokacrafts.com. Any purchase will not only support these artisan communities, but also our nonprofit's wider mission. That's Aloka Crafts, spelled ALOKACRAFTS, one word, alokacrafts.com. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.